Okay, I think I'll go ahead and start. We have still participants coming in. Right now, the number is 27. Welcome, everyone, to the Modern Turkey Talks series at the Department of Political Science and International Relations here at Izmir University of Economics. My name is Serhun. I'm an assistant professor in the department. And today, our guest speaker is Onur Bakıner. Before introducing him and his talk, his title, I want to briefly mention what we are trying to achieve with Modern Turkey Talks series here at the department. Basically, the brief description here is that modern Turkey, with its centuries-long imperial past and the century of Republican experience, has always been one of the most debated topics in political science and international relations, and plus other fields as well. Democracy, democratization, religion and secularism, nationalism and minorities, gender equality and justice, civil-military relations, foreign policy, political economy have been some of the major issues that have been widely discussed within the context of modern Turkey. So in this line of long scholarly tradition, we try to, with this, our Modern Turkey Talk series initiative, try to critically understand and unpack Turkey's social, political, and cultural aspects within a historical, comparative, and global perspective. So for this reason, for the Modern Turkey Talk series, we will invite scholars from various intellectual, theoretical, and disciplinary backgrounds to enrich our understanding of modern Turkey. So today's talk is the second seminar in our Modern Turkey Talks series. The first one was by Fuat Keyman in Sabancı University. And today, our speaker is Onur Bakıner from Seattle University. Let me introduce him, and then I'll briefly tell the title and very brief synopsis, and then I'll leave the floor to Onur Bakıner. So Onur Bakıner received his PhD in political science from Yale University in 2011. He's currently an associate professor of political science at Seattle University. His research and teaching interests include transitional justice, human rights, and judicial politics, particularly in Latin America and the Middle East. He has many articles published on Turkey and Colombia as well, including other cases too, in journals such as Turkish Studies, Memory Studies, Negotiation Journal, Nationalities Papers, and many others. His book, Truth Commissions, Memory, Power, and Legitimacy, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015, has been awarded the Best Book Award by the Human Rights section of the American Political Science Association in 2017. So the title of today's talk is Truth, Justice, and Commemoration Initiatives in Turkey. And this talk will provide an overview of the official Truth, Justice, and Commemoration Initiatives, i.e. policies and gestures to acknowledge and redress past wrongs in Turkey, and will analyze why they have not been successful in satisfying the victims and the broader human rights community. So without further ado, I'll just leave the floor to Onur Bakıner, and thanks again for joining us today.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of the Modern Turkey Talks. And I wish I could be there in Izmir with you all, but Zoom will do for now. So yeah, today's talk is about truth, justice, and commemoration initiatives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide some conceptual clarity on what we're talking about and why we're talking about it, and then move on to the overview. Because, well, both in other languages and in Turkish, we have a large number of sort of concepts that address a similar set of institutional response to past atrocities, right? So things like coming to terms with the past, reckoning with the past, transitional justice, or geçmişe yüzleşme, geçmişe hesaplaşma, geçiş dönemi adaleti. Well, since last year, helalleşme. So, you know, a large number of concepts that sort of talk about the same thing. And what they're talking about is really, in essence, a self-critical attitude to the national past. So some degree of self-distancing from sort of existing national identity projects to be able to address past human rights violations. Now, human rights violations, that's another huge category that I'm not going to go into the detail of, but it's of course one way of talking about wrongs. And it's probably the most prominent way of talking about violence and violations in the modern times, because human rights, it's both a legal and moral language. And so more often than not, when we're talking about a society coming to terms with the past, we're really talking about invoking the human rights norm, human rights legality to come up with institutional measures to address past wrongs. Now, what are those institutional measures? Of course, there is no limit, but some of the most prominent ones are trials. So, you know, the use of courts to prosecute perpetrators of human rights violations, truth commissions, truth and reconciliation commissions also, that are used to find facts about human rights violations and give the victims a chance to narrate their experiences. Reparations policies, again, addressing victims, official apologies, sometimes also unofficial forms of apologies, commemoration, in some cases, removal of past perpetrators from political administrative jobs, something that's also known as lustration, and so on and so forth. So, you know, there's a large repertoire there. We could perhaps also add the education system as one of the mechanisms to actually come to terms with the past, create some awareness around past wrongs, etc. Now, where are we at is of course the subject matter of the talk today. But maybe, you know, one thing that we should always ask ourselves is, why does a society need to come to terms with the past? Or does a society need to come to terms with its past? This is something that I think, you know, we should think about maybe for a second. I mean, obviously, since I'm giving the talk, you might assume that I believe that a society should come to terms with its past. But I think it's always helpful to think about, you know, why this is a necessary thing to do. And you know, what some of the sort of justifications for doing this are. Again, you know, maybe we might get into the details of this during the Q&A, but you know, it's an important thing to ask. And then, of course, the other thing is, what exactly is this past? Some of the models that have become sort of globally quite famous, I think, sort of tend to offer one episode or a series of episodes happening in a short period of time as sort of the subject matter of the past that a society should come to terms with. So to give some examples, in many Latin American countries, say Chile, whose Truth Commission I had studied, there was a dictatorship that lasted 17 years. And so most of the human rights violations took place during that time, and that was the period that was studied. Or apartheid in South Africa, or perhaps most emblematically, the Nazi regime that lasted 12 years, but left a horrifying human rights toll behind. So these are usually sort of seen as the past periods that a society should come to terms with. And when does a society come to terms? It's typically sort of the model, the standard model of transitional justice is that a society starts coming to terms with the past officially when there's a transition away from authoritarianism to democracy, and or transition away from war or civil war to peace. Now, the standard model works in many cases for good reason. Without some degree of distance from the past, it's very difficult to actually build any awareness or bring the institutions, state institutions together to do anything about that past. So, of course, coming to terms with Chile's dictatorship took place after democratization. And so was the case with South Africa. Yet, this very sort of standard model of transitional justice also misses certain things. And that's how I'm going to connect it to Turkey. For one thing, not every society has only one episode or a small number of episodes or one period to come to terms with. In fact, usually episodic periods of violence are actually preceded by other problematic periods that may have been at the root cause of the latest wave of violence or not. And so sort of different episodes of violence and violations following one another is quite a common scenario in world history, and definitely in Turkey. So, saying that there is only one period that we should come to terms with is, might be wrong. In view of the fact that in the past 100+ years, perhaps we can talk about multiple histories with multiple different actors, with multiple different motivations and different contexts of violence and violations. The second issue is the whole transition problem. So again, it sounds very convenient or very logical that a society would come to terms with the past during or after a transition to democracy and peace. It happens sometimes, but also there are societies that had to address the issues of coming to terms with the past in the absence of a clear transition. And of course, what is a clear transition? This is something that was hotly debated in Latin America, for example. Okay, now we have multi-party elections, but many of the elements of the authoritarian past are with us. So, how do we square the circle? How do we reconcile these facts? And again, I'm thinking of countries like Colombia that actually had a peace process and paramilitary demobilization in the absence of peace, or Sri Lanka that actually had a truth commission in the middle of a civil war. So there are also cases like this where you don't really have a transition, but you have many elements of coming to terms with the past. And so for all these reasons, it's a little bit complicated to think about truth, justice, commemoration initiatives in this sort of very clear model of transitional justice in more than a few cases. And my main claim is that Turkey is similar. Turkey has not had an official transitional justice process. First of all, the internal armed conflict in the Kurdish region has been ongoing, so there hasn't been an end to that. The second thing, there isn't really a clear democratization process in Turkey. Looking at the data from the last 40 years since the 1980 coup, what one sees is that there was a period of gradual democratization that sort of probably reached its peak around 2005, 2006. And then there was a process of authoritarian backsliding that was slow, perhaps until 2011-13. And then from then on, there's actually a sort of a much faster process of authoritarian backsliding. So now that doesn't sound like democratization, of course. And so for all these reasons, it's really not possible to talk about a clean break from past violence or past violations in Turkey. Sorry. To add to that, what was I going to say? Well, aside from the absence of a clear transition in Turkey, one other thing maybe we should talk about is that sort of the image of the country that many of us have is that it has deep problems with its past. That there is a certain reluctance to come to terms with the past. That most politicians and also actually a big part of the population doesn't like talking about past human rights violations. In fact, those who talk about those violations get in trouble, sometimes in non-violent ways, but sadly also in many cases in violent ways as well. And so in that way too, Turkey is not a very emblematic case of coming to terms with the past. In fact, sort of in global transitional justice or human rights discourse, is typically used as a sort of a case study of what not to do, rather than what to do. And so, all of these sort of add up to maybe create a bit of a dispiriting, pessimistic picture of whether Turkey can or will come to terms with the past. Now, what I would like to say is that yes, I mean, of course, these are all true. There is definitely no regime transition. There is no end of violence or violations, and for good reason. Turkey has been known for not coming to sort of terms with the past, at least in an official capacity. But there have been actually a lot of developments in the past 20, 25 years in Turkey that we should talk about, that we should take stock of. For their own sake, in order to learn, but also because one day, if there is going to be a process of coming to terms with the past, we're not really starting from a blank slate. We are not sort of starting from a place where nothing has ever been done before. That's actually also not true. There have been many initiatives in Turkey, some of them official, most of them unofficial, that have, in their own ways, tried to bring awareness about past human rights, do justice, both retributive justice, that is to say prosecution of perpetrators, but also bringing some degree of restorative justice, some reparation to victims. There have been a few apologies, far in between, but some. And more than anything, there have been civil society initiatives that have tried to push the issue to the public agenda. Now, I will talk about these, and then also I will talk about why, after saying all these things about Turkey's sort of different ways of coming to terms with the past, why I don't believe that we're still sort of, in the process of coming to terms. Maybe one caveat before we move forward. I also do not want to give the impression that coming to terms with the past is a progress, or sorry, is a sort of a progressive linear process in which you always get sort of you always move forward. Things always move in the right direction. It's not like that, neither in Turkey nor in other places. This is a process with sort of lots of moving back and forth. Definitely, there are multiple actors with multiple interests, and so there is not one right way of doing things. Again, we can get into the details of this more in the Q&A, but yeah. So what I'm not hoping to bring sort of all these different facts together to come up with a narrative of progress. All right, so with that said, I would like to talk a little bit about what has been happening in Turkey with respect to truth, justice, and commemoration initiatives. Again, when we're talking about Turkey, we're not really talking about one major event that happened in a couple of years. We are talking about multiple different histories. I don't know, chronologically, we could start from the most recent to the last, or vice versa. But obviously, there are ongoing human rights violations as of now in the past 5, 6, perhaps 10 years of dissidents, which happens on top of an internal armed conflict that has left tens of thousands of people dead. Before that, there were multiple periods of military coups and military interventions, and especially the 1980 coup left behind a huge human rights toll in terms of extrajudicial murders, torture, some disappearances, exile, etc. Before that, there was some elements of what could be considered a civil unrest during the 60s and 70s, and a lot of violence between well, state groups, state paramilitary groups, but also self-identified left-wing and right-wing groups. There have been also multiple instances of targeting of minorities, like in Istanbul in 1955, Maraş and Çorum between 1978 and 1980, Malatya, the Sivas massacre of 1993. Before the formation of the republic, of course, the mass deportation and killing of Armenians between 1915 and 17. And many more that I've been forgetting. And so we can't really talk about sort of one event or one set of events. It's really multiple periods. And I think this also brings up some normative questions. Should there be some sort of prioritization? Should we start from the most recent ones? Should we start from the ones where the victims are still alive? Or should we not make any prioritization, but basically try to tackle everything all at once? What are our criteria? And again, I don't think there is one answer to any of these questions. It's something that society can or should decide collectively. Now, what has been done with respect to these sort of different forms of violations? Even though the official response has been typically to deny that human rights violations ever happen, or to justify violations sort of as a byproduct of war, byproduct of counterinsurgency. The state has nonetheless taken some steps, sometimes because it was forced to, sometimes out of its own volition. Going back to the 1990s, I think an important source of sort of progress in this area were European Court of Human Rights rulings. As many of you may know, Turkey was actually a member of the has ratified the European Convention on Human Rights as early as 1953, but it only accepted the court's contentious jurisdiction in 1990. And perhaps what was unexpected at the time that many individuals in the Kurdish region began to, and their lawyers began to bring up cases before the European Court in the mid-1990s, and they began to sort of bear fruits in the early 2000s. And so after that, there were some movements by the state to basically limit the amount of money that was being paid to the European Court, and also perhaps save the country's reputation to some extent by trying to limit the sort of the negative judgments in the European Court. And so one state policy, probably the most successful policy so far, was the reparations program that started in 2004. So it was a reparations program to compensate for the losses, and I'm using the official language, as a result of terrorism. But it was widely understood that the reparations program actually provided compensation to victims not only of the PKK, but also victims of state violence. And so the idea was to sort of create this very broad-based reparations program. There are some critiques, and I wrote about that in the chapter in that book on the Oxford Handbook on Turkish politics. There were criticisms that some of the decisions were sort of arbitrary because the determination of who was a victim was left to administrative units. Also non-material losses, so people's sort of psychological losses were not taken into account. It was sort of more driven to compensate for material losses. So there were problems, but still, hundreds of thousands of people benefited from that program. And I would say to this day, it sort of stands out as the most successful and complete official program by the Turkish state when it came to compensating sort of losses in the context of both state-based violence, but also violence by non-state actors. Other than that, we can talk about some maybe partial sort of policy preferences. Of course, the one set of initiatives that perhaps caught the eye more than anything else were the prosecutions of the late 2000s. As you may remember, in the context of this heightened conflict between the military and the AKP and Erdogan's governments, a number of military officers faced courts. Now, some of them faced courts for coup allegations. Some of them, well, Kenan Evren, of course, and Tahsin Şahinkaya faced a court for a coup that actually happened, the 1980 coup. And then also a small number of them, maybe it wasn't as prominent in the press, but a small number of them also faced the courts for human rights violations, and especially with respect to human rights violations towards civilians in the Kurdish region in the early 1990s. So they are called different things. Sometimes they're called the JITEM trials. Sometimes they are known by the alleged perpetrators, like the Çitil case or the Temizöz case, etc. And there was actually some degree of progress in these cases in the early 2010s. You know, facts about human rights violations were being uncovered, or if not uncovered, were being sort of verified by the prosecutor's office for the first time. Now, those trials didn't go very far for reasons that are, of course, very familiar. So after the fallout between the the Gülen community and the government, so after sort of the government labeled the Gülenists a terrorist organization, or even before that, some of the alleged perpetrators basically began to argue that they were being targeted unfairly by sort of pro-Gülen judges and prosecutors, and so their charges had to be dropped. And I mean, of course, there was also some truth to that, so it's not sort of entirely wrong. With that, though, also a lot of the sort of the valuable evidence that had been gathered basically was lost, and so there were acquittals after acquittals after that, and so the trials that could have shed some light on human rights violations were basically lost forever, and no new sort of trial process began after that. I know a few of the alleged perpetrators received promotions from the military after that, and so sort of that momentum was lost. And so prosecutions really didn't move very far. They started, but they didn't go very far. In terms of apologies or commemorative gestures, maybe that is something to talk about, because and I think that is one of the things that maybe the AKP governments sort of have stood out in comparison to earlier governments, was their willingness to sort of engage in gestures that suggested that they cared about coming to terms with the past, or that they would facilitate some processes of coming to terms with the past, and generate some degree of optimism or momentum in civil sectors that were sort of interested in this area. The sort of the most famous one, again, the one that caught the headlines perhaps, was the 2011 apology by Recep Tayyip Erdogan on the subject of the Dersim massacres of 1937-38. Of course, a number of articles have been written on it, so a close reading of the apology suggests that it wasn't much of an apology at all. It was more sort of an effort to blame CHP, the Republican People's Party, for the violence of the time, and of course also the continuity between then and now. So in that way, it wasn't really sort of an official apology that was solemn and that took full responsibility for what happened. It was more sort of taking a jab at a political opponent. Yet, yeah, it was perhaps one of the very first times, if not the first time, a state official said anything resembling an apology. Of course, even before that, the AKP has used this sort of notion of commemoration quite strategically, like the restoration of an Armenian church in Eastern Turkey, the Surp Akdamar Church, and having an official celebration after the restoration of this church. Here and again, bringing up the crimes that were committed in the past, sort of to say that now there is a break with that past, and the AKP represents that break from sort of the past of violence and violations, including, of course, multiple times on the Kurdish issue. And so there were a larger number of commemorative gestures than perhaps ever before. At the end of the day, though, they did not quite amount to a process of coming to terms with the past. Typically, the gains were reversible. The sort of the discourse around awareness of past violations could easily be reversed and had been reversed multiple times. And so this is a question that we should ask ourselves: what happened? But before moving forward, one other thing perhaps to mention is that Turkey hasn't had a truth commission. So, there hasn't been sort of this official truth commission, but there have been multiple truth initiatives, both official and unofficial. Unofficially, human rights organizations have been collecting data since the sort of late 1980s, mostly about the sort of the violence in the Kurdish region, but also on many other forms of violations. Of course, academics have been working on sort of earlier episodes in the archives as well. And so some degree of unofficial truth finding has always been around, and it was mostly thanks to civil society actors or non-government actors that we know what we know, essentially. The government has also undertaken some measures to find facts. Again, no official truth commission, so there hasn't been an independent commission of experts or of individuals who are not affiliated with contemporary politics. Instead, in Turkey, which of course until recently had a parliamentary regime, parliamentary commissions of inquiry have been used prominently to address some past wrongs. So unresolved murders, faili meçhuller in the 1990s, the Susurluk accident of 1996, they were brought up in the 1990s in different parliamentary commissions of inquiry. Likewise, coups, human rights violations, the possibility of a peace process. These were all issues that were debated in subcommittees of the parliament in parliamentary commissions of inquiry. Now, typically they were forgotten after a while. There wasn't a lot of media coverage, or there was only media coverage if something really sensationalist happened, like if the members of parliament had a fight or something like that. Otherwise, there wasn't really much coverage. And so as a result, they didn't really create a huge impact on social norms or societal discussions. Maybe, one exception being the Susurluk era, like 1997, 1998, the Parliamentary Commission report and also the Prime Minister's Inspector's report, Başbakanlık Teftiş Kurulu report. Then they raised the issue and they made a lot of noise. There was more awareness, I think, around these reports. But with the other official efforts to address some sort of past issues, I would say they didn't really make it to the media as much as they should have. But there is something interesting. If you read those reports, and I had to read those reports in the recent past for an academic project, you see that there is actually a lot of official acknowledgement of past wrongs, not only by non-state actors, actors that are sort of labeled insurgencies or terrorist organizations, but also by the state. Members of the parliament actually acknowledge that a lot of bad things were done by state actors. It's usually in coded language. You have to sort of follow their trails to understand what they're objecting to. Nonetheless, if one day there is going to be a future process of coming to terms with the past, again, we're not starting from a blank slate. Actually, different configurations of the parliament in the 90s, but also in the 2010s, have acknowledged past human rights violations, including state sort of driven human rights violations multiple times. And so I think, this is a legacy that, we should take into account when we're going to perhaps talk about coming to terms with the past in the future. So then finally, what happened? Again, the overall theme of this talk is that none of these amount to an official process of coming to terms with the past. So why not? Now, one answer, it's an easy answer, but also, it's a correct answer, is that the instrumentalization of the past, especially of awareness around past wrongs, has prevented current governments as well as the rest of society from, I think, addressing past wrongs in an open, honest, self-critical way. So it's true that perhaps more has been done during the AKP governments than any other period in terms of acknowledging some past wrongs. But this was never done in this sort of self-critical, open, honest way that was meant to really just open the doors to official acknowledgement. Usually it was a lot more calculated than that. So the goal was to perhaps blame an opposition party for a past wrong, or to curry favor with the Kurdish voters. So just sort of try to see if they could be sort of brought over to AKP with some gestures. Sometimes to look sort of nice and reputable to the West, but there was always some sort of an instrumental logic to awareness around past wrongs, apologizing for past wrongs, commemorating past wrongs. There was always some instrumental element. Now, I say it's a simple but correct answer. The simplicity, of course, could be problematic for the following reason. Instrumentalization is how a lot of politics works everywhere in the world. So, politicians are not angels, and even the politicians that we know around the world as sort of being very sort of open and honest about the past, typically also have some sort of strategic calculations in mind. So simply saying that, Erdogan was strategic doesn't really explain much. He was strategic because politicians are strategic. So, what else can we say there? One other thing that, again, I think contributes to maybe providing an answer is that the period when the AKP got sort of more and more interested in addressing the past was also the period in which Turkey was sort of undergoing its authoritarian shift. Now, this matters because at the end of the day, the goal was never a wholesale sort of self-critical account of the past or the present. But again, rather the goal was sort of to consolidate a certain form of government. I think this becomes very apparent in the AKP's relationship to the military. You see a sort of a very critical discourse around the military, especially between sort of 2007 to 2011. Yet, the goal was never to democratize the military or sort of to keep the military out of civilian affairs once and for all. As many events after proved, the goal was really to make the military sort of more compliant with the AKP's priorities and sometimes even usable for those priorities. So the goal was never sort of full democratization or civilianization. So in that context, I think military actors, including some of the alleged perpetrators of past human rights violations, found it easy to negotiate their differences with the AKP and so sort of get out of trouble. And again, I think that explains why at the end of the day, we haven't had continuing prosecution of past human rights violations. Again, the context of that authoritarian shift, I think, explains it to some extent. Now, one final thing that we should talk about is, of course, ideas. A perennial debate in political science, whether people are motivated by strategic calculations or ideas or both. I tend to sort of err on the side of saying that, well, people are motivated by both. And I think it would be wrong to strictly attribute the AKP's or Erdogan's politics around the past to strategic calculation only. I think in many ways they also had a mindset, a set of ideas that enabled them to portray the past in a certain light that was paradoxically both what made some degree of coming to terms with the past possible, but also actually prevented it from sort of reaching its full potential. I talk about this in some writings as majoritarian conservatism. So this idea that Turkey was governed by this sort of dichotomy of sort of conservative, sort of Muslim Democrat actors versus some kind of evil sort of Republican secularist set of actors. I think that was very much central to the narrative of the AKP from the start, and increasingly so in the 2010s. And so it was that kind of an ideational structure, that kind of framing of issues made it possible for the AKP elite to basically claim that, well, human rights violations happened in the past because these bad guys did it. You know, before us, it was all hell, and well, these guys did all the bad things, and if they hadn't, we would have lived in a better society, more democratic, more pluralistic, and more peaceful. The problem is, of course, this kind of narrative doesn't acknowledge that. First of all, the sharp dividing line between the good guys and the bad guys wasn't that sharp in real history. That actors that today's AKP takes to be their forefathers were actually complicit in many of the crimes of the past. And that, you know, you can't really have sort of this sharp dichotomy of the sort of Muslim conservatives versus the Kemalists, you know, the good guys, bad guys. That doesn't really, that doesn't explain history. In Turkey, it's a very sort of simplistic, and it's a false binary. Not to mention the fact that, of course, you know, the crimes that are happening today, or the human rights violations happening today, should be explained in some way other than sort of, again, going back to this binary construction of history. And again, I think this very simplistic binary construction made it possible to some extent for the AKP elite to distance themselves from past wrongs, and sometimes say things that weren't said before. Yet, I think it's also pretty much the reason why they haven't had an open, honest, sort of critical reflection with the past. You know, to give one example, the Sivas massacre trial ended with acquittals after the statute of limitations ran out in 2012. So zaman aşımı, and at the time there were proposals, including proposals by the Republican People's Party (CHP), to actually sort of argue that statute of limitations wouldn't work in cases of grave human rights violations. Either to legislate that or to have that be sort of incorporated into legal interpretation. These were categorically rejected. And if you hear the narrative about something like the Sivas massacre, for example, so coming from government, you hear a lot of noise around conspiracy theories. You hear a lot of sort of noise about how, you know, the people who did it were somehow innocent and somebody else made them do it. It was an accident. It was a mistake. So there is never any acknowledgement that this was a deliberate massacre that was committed by people with conservative credentials, and that there was sort of no proven conspiracy coming from, I don't know, foreign actors or whatever. There's never any acknowledgement of that, and I think that again says something about the construction of sort of memory in AKP governments. So some of the episodes in history that prove to be inconvenient to that construction, that prove to contradict that construction, are basically sort of very conveniently left out, or worse yet, are sort of being clouded over with conspiracy theories. So in closing, and I know I spoke too much, and I would like to hear more from you. In closing, maybe, you know, I would like to say a thing or two about, you know, what the future holds. Again, I'm not going to do any election prediction or anything like that. It's not my job, and I don't think anybody can do it right at this moment. But if if there is some kind of transition of government, I think that is going to open a space for perhaps addressing past wrongs more than now. I think right now it's becoming pretty much impossible for the current government to track back and open up to any sort of human rights initiative. I think they have lost that sort of flexibility where they were moving between liberal and illiberal sort of constantly, the first 10, 12 years of government. I think now the illiberal direction is very much set. So I'm not expecting any sort of human rights initiative coming from this government. Now, a future government will very likely have a lot of people with democratic credentials, a lot of great people who are going to be committed to human rights, and possibly some people who might have been perpetrators of human rights violations themselves. So I think I'm not anticipating a clean break from the past where, the new cadre of governing sort of people will be sort of people who have nothing to do with the crimes of the past. And that's complicated. Now, one glimmer of hope that I have is that, again, there is and there has been over 30, almost 40 years of human rights activism, and also very active, sort of very militant form of activism, a lot of data collection around past human rights violations. So I think, some push from civil society actors might be sort of the best bet if there is going to be sort of any movement towards the acknowledgement of past wrongs and some degree of closure. I think in the past, foreign actors were also usually sort of cited. Of course, earlier in my talk, I talked about the European Court of Human Rights. Now, that's also debatable. Both the Council of Europe and its institutions like the European Court, but also the European Union itself, they have been dealing with, of course, creeping authoritarianism in their backyard. With what's happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think the Council will have to sort of rethink its priorities with respect to human rights. At the European Union level, there are countries like Poland and Hungary that are, I think, giving the sort of the leadership pause about the sort of the human rights and democratic credentials of the Union itself. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I think this idea that some sort of external push is going to be the momentum builder in Turkey for human rights might, that time may have passed, or at least for now, that doesn't seem to be very likely. With that said, going back to domestic actors, again, I think there is now an activist and militantly activist of human rights community. And that's also quite diverse. I spent all of my talk talking about sort of bodily integrity rights violations in the context of some sort of political conflict. Obviously, that's not all human rights. Today you see a proliferation of human rights groups, of workers, including non-unionized workers organization, of LGBT groups. So alongside sort of the more traditional human rights concern, you also see a bit of a diversification, which comes with its own problems, but also comes with more of a sort of more optimism that actually, the movement is very much sort of in line with the times and can push through multiple agendas, not one or two. And so, yeah, I mean, if there's anything, any reason for hope, any reason for optimism, that's sort of where I would place my optimism in the civic sector today in Turkey. I would like to close my talk now, and thank you very much for your time. And I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks a lot for your insights on this timely and significant topic. So we can start the Q&A session. Roughly, we are looking for 30 minutes for this session. You can use the raise hand option to ask your question, or use the chat box to type your question. I have my question ready, but I'll wait for the audience. Okay, I think Burcu, please go ahead.
Hello, this is Burcu Serhun. I'm a PhD student in political science. Thank you for the presentation. I think Turkish politics is much deserving the title of being unapologetic. I think we're coming from a state culture, political culture that is not fine with apologizing. I am personally a big fan of apologies. I'm a person that cannot fully go on with her life when the offender doesn't offer a genuine apology. So in taking that to the Turkish political context, living in a country where the political culture is not fine with offering apologies is hard. Since some atrocities have taken place a long while ago, it makes even the cases more debatable, because sometimes when you think of it, apologizing for the past wrongs, the question is that should we be held responsible for the wrongs of our grandfathers, for the wrongs of our even ancestors? But I think we should. My question is, do you think apologizing works? Do you think it makes amends? I think it was William Bradford who called it the age of apology, because we have been receiving a lot of apologies from everywhere around the world. I mean, Germany apologized for the surviving Jews. I mean, Queen Elizabeth apologized to the Maori. USA apologized for the Japanese internment during the Second World War. Trudeau apologized recently for the residential school practices of the Aboriginal children, for taking them away from their families and so on. As you mentioned, Tayyip Erdogan apologized for the Dersim, but not really apologized, but offered condolences to the Armenians who have suffered during the deportation. So it seems to be really an apology, an age of apology, and I wonder what you think about that. Do they really work in making amends? Thank you.
So should I answer? Should I take? Do you want to take multiple?
Yeah, I think let's go one by one.
Okay. Yeah, great question, and I agree about the age of apology comment. That has triggered a debate about whether apologies are just cheap talk, and there are some analyses of the British apology for the Bloody Sunday, or I think it was Stephen Harper, the Canadian apology for Indian residential schools. Now, I mean, on the one hand, commemorative gestures run the risk of being empty, because again, they don't really provide anything material. They are doing sort of the easier thing to do. You don't give anything out of pocket. You don't put anybody in jail. So, just apologize. I think where the apology works is that it gives the survivors or the descendants of the survivors at least some degree of awareness that the country doesn't treat them as suspect or their accounts as lies, that the country now acknowledges that what happened to them is true, that it happened. So I think in that way, it does provide some degree of sort of symbolic, but also psychological sort of support and closure to the descendants of the victims. But if it's not accompanied by more action, I mean, obviously it is just cheap talk. And so yeah, I mean, that is sort of my 2 cents on this. And in terms of the sort of the culture of not apologizing, I completely agree that I think we should normalize apologizing. I mean, not only in Turkey but elsewhere. It's just this notion that, you know, apology makes a person or a country look weak is, I think, quite outdated. Yet, you know, again, it finds its place in multiple cases. And then one final thing about what you said, I think the issue of transgenerational responsibility is something that we should perhaps talk about more as well. So am I responsible for the things that my grandparents' generation did? And again, it's one of those things where there isn't one right answer. It's just that I think today the sort of the received wisdom is that maybe individuals aren't, but the state is. The state in many ways represents the continuity between the past and the present, right? I mean, we are responsible for laws that our great parents passed, or they didn't pass, they just saw it passed and they were responsible as well. But anyways, like if a state ensures continuity with respect to its laws, with respect to its identity, with respect to its territory, it might follow that then it should also assume responsibility for past wrongs. And so there should be continuity and transgenerational continuity for acknowledging state responsibility. But other than that, like the broader question of transgenerational responsibility, I think it's open for debate for sure.
Thank you, Burcu. Umutcan?
Well, Dr. Bakıner, thank you for this great talk. So I have one question that puzzles me for some time. Right, in transitional justice literature, there's a long debate that gravitates around finding that right balance between justice and peace. So on the one hand, a decision to ignore atrocities can carry a high price, so it may destabilize the peace process. So on the other hand, creating conditions for justice requires bargaining with the wrongdoers, at least in the short run. So this division, I believe, almost implies a dichotomy. So let's imagine we have another round of Kurdish peace process in Turkey in the future, hopefully not in the distant future, but in the near future. And this time it was relatively successful. So considering Turkey's context and history, would it be possible or effective to move on from this dichotomy, in your opinion, this justice versus peace dichotomy? For instance, would it be enough to follow like forgive and forget approach like we observe in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's debated in the transitional justice literature whether it's a dichotomy or if they're mutually reinforcing. I mean, the dichotomy part is pretty obvious. You know, when in order to have peace, sometimes we have to make concessions, and sometimes concessions to both sides. And so if there are human rights violators on both sides or one of the sides, those violators will not want peace. Others say that, well, this is not a dichotomy, it's more mutually reinforcing, because actually a society that is free of violence can only be built upon the foundations of some degree of accountability for what happened in the past. If you stop this round of violence by forgetting about all the things that happened in the past, well, there's going to be some new form of violence in the future. It's up for grabs. I think more sort of pragmatically, one set of solutions these days, I think, is to separate between different categories of crimes and prosecute some and not prosecute all. When transitional justice emerged as a field in the 1990s, many of the lawyers who were sort of in the human rights sector, their idea was that, well, we should prosecute 100% of the perpetrators. You know, that's the only way. And of course, that kind of moral absolutism has its own place too. But lately, I think there has been some more pragmatism to think that maybe not 100%, but those who committed the sort of the gravest crimes, or those who were in command positions. Like I could talk about the peace process with Colombia. I think that was sort of a pragmatic bargain that way. Rank and file soldiers and rank and file members of FARC were pretty much left off the hook, so they were not prosecuted in the context of the sort of the peace process. With people committing sorry, more serious crimes, they were basically incentivized to commit to their crimes and tell the whole story, and in return get reduced sentences. So again, from the perspective of the justice sector, probably they get to more facts that way, because the perpetrators are in a position to confess. But the dilemma, the bargain, is that these people who would have had to serve 30 years in prison, like the maximum sentence in prison for massive human rights violations, like for massacres, for massive sexual violence, for torture, they basically got away with like 5 years, 8 years. And so that was sort of the bargain. Again, I'm not saying that we should do that, but I think it's something that should be considered, you know, perhaps instead of sort of thinking about the dichotomy, to find sort of more pragmatic, a more pragmatic balance.
Thank you. Deniz?
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm trying to open my video. Yes. Hello, I'm Deniz. I'm a PhD student in the University of Economics. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I have comments and questions about your speech. So first of all, you mainly focus on the state and official initiatives while you're talking about the process of coming to terms with the past. And here I have some doubts, because is it really possible to analyze this process while only focusing on official initiatives? Because, I mean, it is quite problematic. Even in Turkey, there are quite limited civic initiatives. There are initiatives, and they are doing more than just fact-finding. For instance, in your article, you mentioned the Human Rights Association, but there are also some other civic initiatives, and they organize lots of conferences, memory walks, and other very important events, not quite popular maybe, but important events, just really to influence the public memory and to influence the process of coming to terms with the past in the full meaning. So I think I found it a bit problematic, because you focus on mainly on the official initiatives. And this is my first comment. The second one is about your comment on AKP's initiatives and their intention, I would say, because you said that they were not only strategic calculations, but you saw a kind of a sincere, genuine intention that they really wanted to maybe come to terms with the past. And I have difficulty to understand this, because all the examples you have given, they are very, they are implemented in very short periods. And we see right after getting some economic or political benefits from the European Union mainly, they stopped it immediately. And even they turned their access towards more non-EU process-related politics. They immediately gave up of all of this process. So if you really think that they were not only strategic calculation, can you give an example of a genuine and very important act about coming to terms with the past? Thank you.
All right, I'll start from the second one. I didn't say that their intentions were sincere or genuine. What I meant to say was that their behavior was very much influenced by their strategic concerns, as well as sort of a set of ideas that they constructed, sort of a certain framing of the past. So, I mean, I don't believe that there was any genuine effort to come to terms with the past on the part of the leadership. Now, of course, you know, doing a bit, maybe sort of, I also don't want to simply say that, how to put this, I think I maybe do a better job in writing than maybe talking about this, but, you know, when we say something like, you know, AKP, we're talking about, well, one leader, an increasingly sort of smaller circle of people, and then maybe a sort of a bigger circle of politicians, an even bigger circle of supporters. So of course, I cannot really sort of police everyone and say that, well, this one was sincere, that one wasn't sincere. From the perspective of the leadership, though, I can, I think, say with a lot of confidence that there wasn't really any genuine effort. Again, I cannot really speak for every single one of them, but definitely from the perspective of the leadership, I mean, I agree with you 100% that what happened wasn't a genuine process of coming to terms with the past. It was just that it was a mixture of strategic sort of calculations and their sort of particular framing of the past. With respect to civic initiatives, absolutely, I think I didn't do justice to sort of the things that I've studied and written on. I myself work with Hafıza Merkezi sort of in different projects, and so it is true that the civic initiatives in Turkey are not just about sort of finding facts, but one, about raising awareness. Also initiatives like the Saturday Mothers, Cumartesi Anneleri, that sort of mobilize and actually sort of in their own way sort of disrupt the state's narrative of official forgetting and silencing. Also, there are a lot of local initiatives, parks, the naming of public spaces, monuments, sometimes done by the municipal government, but in other times by local artists, local citizens or neighbors initiatives. These all count for something. So in that way, I agree that I think Turkey has sort of a vibrant civic sector when it comes to coming to terms with the past. And also this sort of maybe feeds a debate about the role of the state in transitional justice. I think it's obvious that the state has more money and it has a justice system behind it, and so has more opportunities to actually do things when they want to do things. And so in that way, sometimes they are prioritized as the sort of the main actor in transitional justice. But there are two problems with that. One, states are usually also the perpetrators, and so there's always this sort of very complicated balance in human rights. You expect things from the state, but the state is also part of the problem, if not the only problem, or the main problem. And then the second problem that you highlight is that civic initiatives actually are usually at the sort of the very first step of any initiatives of coming to terms with the past, including official ones. If it weren't for citizens mobilization, most of the time politicians wouldn't be incentivized to do anything about human rights issues.
Thank you. Ali Açıkgöz.
Hello. Thank you for the interesting talk, and thanks for arranging the talk to everyone. I don't have a question, but I'm going to bring a case that might be interesting for you. That is the Democratic Party's trials, and then the question of amnesty, which is a decade-long process. And it ends with, in 1969, I think, with the İnönü reconciliation. It's an individual reconciliation, but then it's sort of interesting in the sense that it's very costly for İnönü to do that. So in that sense, he's kind of maybe sincere, but then the whole reconciliation goes on to defeat the bill of the amnesty for the former Democratic Party members in jail. So I don't know, it might be, I don't know if it fits to your research in the brackets of your research limitations, but that might be an interesting case because, again, it's very politicized and at the same time, it's very public. And then it ends in an interesting twist. So I wanted to bring that up to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it also raises another issue, which is how to deal with the past regime, because of course, one of the criticisms, not only in Turkey, around the world is that sometimes transitional justice is used to eliminate a part of the political elite in favor of a counter elite. Especially during the lustration of Eastern and Central Europe in the early 1990s, there was a lot of criticism that in places like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia at the time, that former communist officials were sort of being labeled as undesirables and being sort of forced to leave politics, but that would just open the doors for sort of political actors, new political actors who didn't have to face any competition. You know, they didn't have to deal with political competitors, but you know, they could simply discredit their competitors and sort of have monopoly on power. And now I'm bringing this up because, of course, in Turkey, that's always said too, like every single time a politician brings up sort of possibility of regime change or government change, they say devri sabık yaratmayacağız. So, you know, we're not going to create an ancien regime, you know, we're not going to sort of blame and punish the former regime for the sort of for the crimes of the past or alleged crimes of the past. It's a difficult balance because, yes, I mean, we don't want the new government to simply sort of punish people for doing nothing but participating in politics, but then there are also serious crimes and they have to be punished. And punishing them has a cost, and not punishing them has also a cost. My personal view is that we should stick to human rights, the human rights framework, both as a moral and legal parameter to decide who should be punished and for what. My point being that people accused of serious human rights violations, you know, violations that end with sort of bodily integrity rights violations, should be punished regardless of their sort of political standing in the previous regime. And with lesser crimes, you know, there could be alternative punishments or I don't know, maybe some sort of reconciliation. Of course, you know, something that I'm sure we're going to talk about more in the coming years is economic crimes like corruption, right? I mean, technically, it may or may not be considered a human rights violations, but of course, it's a huge problem. It drains resources from citizens. How to punish that? And again, I don't have answers. Well, I mean, I know some models, like for example, Tunisia, during its transition after 2011, they actually had sort of two tracks, one sort of truth commission for human rights violations and one for financial crimes, what they called financial crimes. So corruption is now sort of taken more seriously, and accountability for corruption has become an important transitional justice concern. It's just that I think it's also a societal decision. I think there should be open debate about what we want to see punished and how we want to see it punished if and when there's a government change in the future. But I think the example of the Democratic Party amnesty is definitely interesting, fascinating. So thank you.
Devrim Hocam.
Thanks for the excellent talk. I have 3 questions. And the first one is concerned with the problem of justification, which you briefly mentioned in your speech. There seems to be a significant dose of confusion in public discourse, certainly, and sometimes in the discourse of political actors, official actors, but also even in the writings of scholars and historians, and sometimes in the discourse of civic initiatives as well. So the confusion is about the way in which we might justify the processes of coming to terms with the past. Some people talk about healing the wounds. Some other people talk about, you know, we have to come to terms with the past because it's for the sake of democratization. And sometimes people talk about, you know, it's for the sake of justice. But surely these are not the same things. These are different priorities: democratization, justice, healing the wounds. Would you like to say more on that, the problem of justification? This is the first question. And the second question, well, it's not really a question, but more like a riddle in the field of coming to terms with the past. And you also mentioned this in your talk, and it is concerned with the problem of prioritization, how to prioritize past wrongs. And this is really a problem, especially when there's not one, single episode in the national past, but a series of episodes of violations, injustices, and wrongs, which seems to be the case, as you pointed out, in Turkey as well. So from where to start? From the distant past or from more recent past? You can skip this question if you find it meaningless. And the third question is about this talk about helalleşme. Where does this term helalleşme stand in this long debate? Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Great questions. We could spend the rest of the day tackling any one of these questions. So first of all, the problem of justification. I agree that there is a bit of a confusion about what coming to terms with the past is good for. And I think it's also, it has philosophical underpinnings. So on the one hand, you could make a sort of a much more sort of deontological Kantian commitment to justice for its own sake. And so, doing the right thing is always is right. Versus, I think a lot of people in the transitional justice scholarship, they are actually way more sort of pragmatic, and their way of looking at coming to terms with the past as well. It's good for something. It's going to make us more peaceful, more democratic, wealthier, etc. And I agree that I think both of these should be taken into account. Now, to me, sort of personally, I think my ethics should be, especially as a researcher of these themes, my ethics should be guided by sort of taking the perspective of the most vulnerable, most marginalized members of society. I believe that I have this career, I have this life, thanks to having studied them. And I think, one thing that I should do at all times is to, take them as the sort of the measure of everything. So, it's an ethical commitment to the victims of human rights violations. And I think it should be done for their sake. Now, of course, for a politician who has to win elections, who has to run the treasury, they might not be so committed to the victim's perspective. They might want, quick results, because that's how politics sort of sometimes works. So I think, especially for those of us maybe in positions of sort of researching this phenomenon or being activists in human rights, I think it's completely I think we should be sort of more committed to this idea of the ethics of coming to terms with the past. But at the end of the day, if we are going to be sort of strategic and pragmatic, I think we can only incentivize politicians with some sort of material reward, like, your vote share will increase, or I don't know, if you solve this, Europeans will like you better, or something like that. And it's sad to admit that, but I think generally politicians are motivated that way. And so I think sort of mixing the deontological commitment to the marginalized and vulnerable with a more pragmatic ethics might be necessary in this kind of work. Prioritization question, again, I think maybe instead of prioritizing one thing versus the other, a better approach might be to find different institutional mechanisms of coming to terms with the past based on the issue area. So what I mean is that if the victims are alive, and probably that means we're talking about the violations of the 80s and 90s and beyond, like the more recent period, then obviously reparations will be much more relevant, and maybe a reparations program should be extended. Or if the perpetrators are young and alive, I think government should do more to sort of incentivize prosecutors to go after them. In terms of, whereas for more distant past, I think at this point, maybe prosecutions or reparations wouldn't work, but the Truth Commission would work better because there is still a lot of disinformation about the more distant past. So, you know, I think, you know, this could be sort of one of the answers to the question. But in terms of still, you know, if prioritization will have to happen, I think that should also be a sort of a societal conversation. It has happened in other countries and with mixed results. I'm thinking of Chile, for example. Throughout the 1990s, the victims, not victims, the survivors or the relatives of the disappeared were sort of the category that was more sort of taken care of, let's say. Official responses were more interested in the disappeared, their relatives, and some of the survivors, whereas torture, for example, was not a major issue at all. And then in the 2000s, there were huge efforts, mobilizations to bring torture to the political forefront. So again, we're talking about people who agree, you know, victims who agree politically, who are all victims. So, you know, it's not like, you know, they are in some sort of competition. They agree that something has to be done. But still, in terms of priorities, I think one has to fight in order to sort of get some sort of official recognition. And so, you know, that might happen in Turkey as well. Finally, helalleşme. There were a lot of discussions, also Twitter discussions about how to translate this term, I think, like a couple of months ago. I think it sounds close to, I mean, obviously there is a sort of, I think there is a sort of a Muslim or Islamic sort of connotation to it. Maybe one term that comes close to it is reconciliation, in the sense that reconciliation also has some sort of a moral, almost religious aura to it, and that unlike hesaplaşma, so, you know, seeking accountability, it's not clear about whether it wants retribution, it wants punishment. So in that way, maybe, you know, that sort of, that will be a translation. At the end of the day, I think any sort of reconciliation should include some degree of punishment, or at least some degree of accountability. At least some people should be found wrong. It can't be like, let's forget about this and move on. There should definitely be some degree of accountability for the past. Again, just how it's going to happen, you know, that's sort of more open for debate. But I think as a moral or philosophical term, I really hope that helalleşme ends up meaning some degree of accountability that is accompanied by also sort of reconciliation gestures. The way that I want to understand it, I don't know if that's how it was meant, is that there are also major sections of this society who are obviously not human rights perpetrators. Like, you know, as in any society, the majority of the people don't really have much to do with the actual commission of crimes. And there's a lot of polarization in that part of society as well. And so maybe finding ways to initiate dialogue and making sure that, you know, these different societal sectors listen to one another, understand each other's grievances, could be and must be an important part of coming to terms with the past as well. So, you know, that is what I sort of want to understand, perhaps, from this more conciliatory tone on coming to terms with the past.
Thank you. Any last comments or question? Well, if not, I think we can close it up. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your great questions. And of course, thank you, Onur Hocam, for your insights and talks.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me, and again, for all of your questions, and for sticking around for an hour and a half. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.